example with the Manette Mondiale is very simple. If you've been there, people coming to the microphone and saying, "Look, I am so and so representing 297 organizations globally, worldwide, blah blah blah. But I'm here to speak in my private." Yeah. This is not democracy. We need outreach. We need to end users. Everybody who uses a phone, everybody who uses the internet, basically needs to know the basics of internet governance. And what really shocked me and drove me to the microphone is a recent comment from a colleague of mine who said, the end users, they don't want to know and they don't deserve to know. They only need it to work. And I'm totally against it. That was point number one. Point number two is a little bit different, even because I can't pronounce a word, because I'm German. It's all about sovereignty. I hope I got it right this time.
Sovereignty.
Sovereignty. Okay, forget it. I say it how I can speak it and end of story. The point is, we are working in internet governance based on a concept of sovereignty, based on the Treaty of Westphalia a few hundred years ago. And everybody's saying, oh, we have something about the same revolution like the printing press. Yes, do you know what happened with the printing press? Ink went, writing ink got out of business. We need to change our concept and need in internet governance, and especially when we're now talking about the energy transition, redefine what sovereignty means on the internet. That doesn't mean taking anything away from anybody, but we need to redefine things like that. And for example, sovereignty now is based on territory. How about, for example, in the new internet governance, basing it, for example, on the ability to implement and things like that. Even people like windsurfer and so on are talking about it since many, many years and bringing up that issue, and I'm seeing it popping up in a lot of articles and conversations, but nobody seems to moving that topic ahead. And I think we should use that accident by the energy transition, or that curse of the energy transition, also to talk a little bit about the deeper concept of the whole thing. Thank you, that was more than 3 minutes. No, I don't know.
Klaus, I do, but would you just write your name? And I'm going to call your issue, Klaus, if it's okay with you, awareness/informed participation by more citizens. Is that okay as an issue? Awareness and informed participation by citizens in internet governance. Is that, am I? Sorry? Base democracy. Okay, Pam? Base democracy in internet governance. Fantastic. And sovereignty. Yes. Okay, Mr. Del Bianco.
Thanks, Meryl. It's Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice. The short title for the issue, and I haven't done a policy slam, and I might get this wrong, is the right to be forgotten is wrong. European courts recently approved, in the case of one company and one plaintiff, the notion that you could force a search engine to suppress legal and valid search results if the person whose name was used to invoke the search results feels that they were out of date, extensive, or otherwise harmful to them. And the European Court has forced that ruling upon Google, one of my NetChoice member companies in Europe, but it could just as easily extend to other search engines as well. And Google has received tens of thousands of requests. And in many cases, the requests to be suppressed in a search result come from a politician wanting to suppress search results based on their name that revealed a scandal or some embarrassment. In some cases, it was architects, contractors, and others who had complaints by disgruntled clients, and they want to suppress those complaints from coming back when you do a search. Criminal records, which are certainly valid to somebody who's trying to determine whether an employee is going to be appropriate for dealing with children. So search suppression, I heard a few grumbles when I suggested that the right to be forgotten was wrong. And that's because some might believe that it's a fundamental protection of your privacy. But if that's the case, then pursue where the data actually lives. This whole case was because a Spanish newspaper kept permanent online records of its criminal and bankruptcy proceedings that occurred in that country. So that when you put this gentleman's name in, his bankruptcy would show up in the search results. And he said that was impairing his ability to get loans or get business. Well, yeah, it should. If he feels like the search engine should suppress it, that's one thing, but a better angle is to go back to the actual Spanish newspaper and get them to change their policy for how long they preserve and post bankruptcy rulings. But instead, this court has said, we're going to try to nip it during the search process. And I think this is a really misguided process. It's going to undermine the openness and information availability that we've come to value the web for. And I hope it's discussed at IGF.
Okay, so we need another issue. An issue that is being driven by technology or innovation that is not yet being addressed in internet governance. Garland. Thank you.
Not as eloquent as Steve here, but I'll try. So, it's Garland McCoy with Technology Education Institute. And I've been working in this suit for decades, actually. But I was circling back on an issue that I worked on with Maryland, actually, and a bunch of the IGF-USA folks when we did scenarios. And the first scenario that I was tasked to work on, and we built it around internet islands. So the idea that, unfortunately, what's basically happened here is, where you have intranets or you have sovereign countries that are setting up very walled fortresses, if you will, in terms of the monitoring of the content coming in and out of the country. That combined with a lot of the work that I do more in terms of the plumbing of the internet, how the internet is changing architecturally. So you've gone from somewhat of a flat architecture back at the beginning to one that is very dependent on core infrastructures, very, very large data centers, very large global peering centers, etc. Now, it's moving very rapidly out to the edge because of a lot of technical issues. But so circling back on this, what happens? So this is a sort of a question when you start having very micro, very local control, very local peering, M-to-M machines, the M-to-M communication as we have buildings and cars and everything communicating with each other. When you have local caching of content, local cloud computing, local data management, all right in your Arlington County address or Fairfax County, whatever. So what happens when the sovereignty issue gets down at that micro level? Some of you may or may not know to this day, to lay fiber out or to do any kind of work, you have to get the local permission to get the right-of-ways to do infrastructure work. So you can see a lot of control coming in, taxes coming in, regulation coming in at the local level as the internet moves out to the edge. So that's a policy issue I'd throw on the table that's going to hit, actually it's hitting right now, but it's going to hit as Netflix and others move out. So anyway, thanks. Well, what's the title? I guess policy concerns at a micro sovereignty level. So again, when the internet's in your backyard, literally.
How about edge-related governance?
Perfect. There, see, so I knew she'd come up with.
Pablo.
Hi, my name is Pablo Molina. I teach at Georgetown University, but I'm also on the board of the Electronic Privacy Information Center here in Washington, D.C. And something that I think has an impact on the way we live and we use technology and new development is precisely the Internet of Things. There was interestingly, 2 weeks ago, or maybe almost 3, a very interesting Supreme Court decision on the cases of cell phone privacy. If you haven't read the opinions directly, I recommend that you do so, because they're really, at times, they're funny opinions, and it's not, the Supreme Court is not known for writing funny statements or opinions. But basically the opinions say this: if the police arrest you, before they can go through everything in your cell phone, they need a judge to evaluate how much they can look into. And this is very important, because this phone has much more than just the last calls you made or the photos that you took. It also unleashes access to all the information that you have loaded in the cloud. So we would argue that it makes sense for law enforcement to gain access to some of that information, whatever is pertinent to the case. But there should be an independent body reviewing how much law enforcement agencies can look into the devices that you carry. Now, fast forward to the Internet of Things. And don't assume that this case is automatically going to apply to everything else. But this could also, this type of searches can also be used against anything else that you wear that is connected to the Internet. And today it's only the mobile phone, but if you have a Fitbit device or some other fitness device, they could look into that to track your movements. If you're wearing Google Glasses, in the next installment, I am pretty sure they also come with GPS location and other information. Anything that happens to be in your car, all of those sensors and computers could also be used for this particular purpose. And imagine all the other devices that you're going to have in your home connected to the Internet. So once again, our concern there is the following: that these are wonderful technologies, that we want them to be available for everybody. We just want to make sure that they're not being abused either by the cyber criminals or by corporations who are misusing the data, or even by law enforcement that are going beyond the restrictions of the legal framework in order to advance their own interests. We need a good system of checks and balances, and we need multi-stakeholder opinions and debate in order to find the right privacy level for these Internet of Things. So I would say, I would call this the privacy of the Internet of Things.
Thank you. We are going to take questions a little bit later. Would you hold that? I want to get more people up to the microphone, and we're going to spend, we've got time for probably 5 or 6 more speakers.
Thank you. I'd like to do 2, actually, but the first one is very short. My name is Andrew Bridges. I'm a lawyer with Fenwick & West in Silicon Valley. I tend to represent entrepreneurs and innovators. The first is perhaps a misguided emphasis on the virtues of free speech. We heard about free speech several times today. I don't deny that it's important. But in the technological world, free speech means nothing without freedom of association and freedom of assembly. I traveled to Syria before things blew apart in July 2010, couldn't access Twitter, Yahoo, Skype from my computer and the like, and it concerned me at the time, what did I think that the regime was bothered by? The fact that people could not access Facebook and Twitter and the like. It was that the regime was bothered by people getting together and people connecting. And we need to recognize that the rights of virtual assembly and the rights of association are actually fundamental, because it's no big deal to have free speech if you're entitled to your free speech in a cornfield with nobody allowed to come near you, unless there's somebody associating with you or participating with you, communicating with you. It's important. So I think we should broaden the free speech discussion to embrace free assembly and free association through technological means. That's the first. The second point I'd like to make, the title is The Rule of Law. When we talk about what's
important in internet governance. I think that people are importing into the discussion their sense of what is fair and just and proper for creating the best outcomes. And the discussion of transparency and openness and the multi-stakeholder inclusion, I think these discussions reflect some underlying concepts of the rule of law. I would like to elevate the discussion about the rule of law as the underlying premise of all that we're trying to do in this work. Now let's be explicit, however, about what the rule of law is. The rule of law is not obedience to existing authority. Some would like us to say that. It's not. That is not what the rule of law is, existence to existing authority. The rule of law is about transparency, openness, notice, and an opportunity to be heard, impartiality, and accountability. Those are characteristics of a regime that operates within the rule of law. And it is good that we apply that in the internet governance sphere. But what can governments learn about the rule of law from our discussions of the rule of law in the internet governance sphere? Why not apply all of these principles in other areas that very, very much affect technologies and usage of the internet, such as trade agreements and the creation of trade agreements and the negotiation over provisions in trade agreements, now secret, that may affect the future of technology and internet use? How does the rule of law comport with government's secret enforcement? I defended a domain name seizure where the government kept secret from the world the existence of a proceeding where a domain name had been seized allegedly because of links to 4 infringing songs, until the government gave up after 6 months of having knocked a hip-hop blog off the web. And all of its extensions of time to seek forfeiture of the domain were kept secret because the government did not want to expose that it had no facts to follow through with the forfeiture. Secret proceedings and trade agreements such as the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, ACTA, promote the proliferation of secret ex parte proceedings in court. So I would like for us to take the discussion of the things that we think are important in internet governance and turn them back to some discussion about what we think is important about governance. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have one more? So Steve's going to give us another one. I'm looking around. You know, the risk is that, again, I call you to the microphone.
And she will. Watch out. Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice. This issue is titled, What Happens to Your Online Presence When You Die? It's a hotly debated issue here in the United States, as trust and estate attorneys have suggested that once you die, they go into your office, they sweep everything off your desk and out of your drawers, and they just assume that they can take control of your Facebook account, your email account, and any other online presence that you have. And that flies in the face of the terms of service and privacy expectations that people have. When I use a Yahoo email account, I know that Yahoo will destroy my email, delete it all, upon notification of my death. When they're notified of my death, the account goes away, and that gives me comfort to know that would be the account I might use for things I don't want my heirs to deal with. On the other hand, private communications that I'm using in Facebook, Facebook has a great way of handling it when you die. They memorialize the account so that no new friends can be added. You can't post as if you're still alive, but people can say great things about you, put pictures up if they were already your friends before you passed away. That lasts for several months, and then Facebook takes it down. That's an option. You could take it down immediately if you wish in Facebook. And on top of all this, if in fact the Trust and Estates Bar says when they take over a dead person's account, they believe they stand in the shoes of the dead person. And this is perhaps uniquely legal concept in the United States. I don't know what it's like around the rest of the world. But they think that by standing in the shoes of the deceased, they have full access to all the communications that that deceased person had with everyone else they communicated with. Well, in the United States, we have a federal law, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. I'd be interested to learn whether other nations do the same thing. But that makes it a felony. It makes it a federal crime for Yahoo or Google, Microsoft to turn over an email to somebody else without consent. Because we treat Yahoo, Google, Microsoft, we treat them as custodians of your email, and they're holding on to it. And as a custodian, they have no authority to give that to any government without a court order, and they can't just give it to a trust and estate attorney who says, I've taken over their account. They can in fact be sued because someone else is usually on the other side of that email. So before I died, I was emailing with an acquaintance, and their information then gets turned over to the estate and becomes public. They can sue the email provider for turning it over without consent. So we have federal law, we have expectations and terms of service with respect to our online persona, and they should all be respected when we die. And I'll add one final caveat. We should also consider what happens not just to your communications, but to your digital assets. Your music, movies, songs, books, and games, all these things that you accumulate on your machine. Many of them are pursuant to a license that expires when you expire. That's one of the reasons the movie was so cheap, or that the song was only 99 cents, is because it wasn't a permanent, transferable copy of the song. It was a license for you to use while you were alive. And if that's the case, the Trust and Estates Bar has no business sweeping all those into a box and distributing them to the heirs. That violates the license terms. Thank you.
Boy, I learned a lot from that one. Okay, we have.
Hello, I'm Carl Rauscher, and I'm currently doing some work with the IEEE. I'm an electrical engineer who spent about 25 years in the Bell Labs environment, and then most recently spent about 5 years as a Chief Technology Officer and a Distinguished Fellow at the East-West Institute, where I led some bilaterals with China and Russia on some very difficult issues. And one of the main things I'm doing in my life now is encouraging more technologists to be engaged in policy issues, because I believe that electrical engineers have transformed the world more than any profession in history, with the exception of a few spiritual leaders, and yet we're not often invited or not often interested in being at the policy table for various reasons, but yet we can unlock a lot of the solution space that and clear the air on a number of issues. So the title of my talk is, or suggestion here is a reality check for the governance bandwagon. And just to set a little context, cyberspace is basically made up of 8 ingredients. You don't need a 9th, and you can't. It doesn't work with a 7th. And these ingredients are basically power and environment, things need to exist somewhere, whether it be the undersea floor where undersea cables lie, or building, or space where satellites are. But you need an environment. Then you have the hardware that's powered, by electricity. Excuse me. And then you have software that rides on top of the hardware. The hardware is connected together with networks. You have the payload that goes across it that includes your traffic and the signaling and control messages. Then you have human beings throughout the whole life cycle. And the 8th ingredient is generally referred to as policy, or more specifically, different categories of agreements, standards, policies, and regulations. I have a number of publications about this, but this is a comprehensive way of understanding what makes up the cyberspace. And I provide this as a context because why do we need policy? I can explain why we need electricity, why we need hardware, software, networks, and all that, but why do we need policy? And fundamentally, we need policy because we need to be able to anticipate the behavior of other entities, whether those entities be individuals, whether they be governments, companies, other organizations, or machines. Increasingly, that's going to be the issue going forward. And so policy, to anticipate the behaviors of other entities, there's different types of policy. You could have agreements where if you make voluntary handshake agreement, you could begin it, you can end it whenever you want. Contracts. You also have standards, which are reference points, not necessarily the way you have to do it, but it's a common reference point to enable things to be done. You could have regulations where you force the behavior, which often I think is the hopefully the last resort. But one of the problems is for the person whose only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so getting back to my main point about the assumption that governance is needed to solve every problem. And I think to wrap up, the reality check is those that are actively involved in governance in the coming years should remember that if they don't do this right, and it becomes uncomfortable for people to use what they've created, the path that they take things down. With these ingredients that are available now and the experience that people have around the world, if you basically have a processor, you have a computer, and you're connected to the world, there could be, alien networks, there could be things in parallel or tunneling being taking place that will just, divert away attention and activity from whatever path that, we're being led down with unacceptable types of governance. So to me, it's actually an optimistic message that electrical engineers are perfectly capable, and the world is quite motivated, I think, with what it has enjoyed in the past decade to maintain that and even to build on it. So if things don't head in the right direction with governance, there is a reality check that there will be other paths taken. So the message is to keep in mind that there is this reality check. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Julia Schütze. I study at the University of Stirling in Scotland, journalism and politics. And I'm in DC for an internship with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, a think tank, a German think tank. I'm really new to this field, but I'm thinking about writing my bachelor thesis about cyberspace, cybersecurity, and the topic which I was mostly interested in was big data. And what struck me the most was that I felt, at least from my research, that technology and policy and internet governance are not as connected as they could be. And especially for big data, for example, I looked up, there are sites where you can look up what kind of data is out there. And it's more probability and not a fact anymore. And to control that, I think it's necessary to maybe have an entity which can ensure that some data which is out there about you, for example, I'm 21 and I have 2 kids. Well, I don't have 2 kids, so how did the big data analyzed, or these algorithms actually found out online that I might have 2 kids, which is not true. But I might be judged on that in reality. So in Germany, I know that there are in companies privacy analysts and data analysts who can ensure external and internal that data which is received is for fact, and that you can, if you're wrongly judged, that you can make it right. But with big data, I think it's not really, you can't really grab it, or why did these algorithms found this out. So I think it would be interesting maybe to think about if there should be more technicians employed in companies and the government in general who know why these algorithms, give out this data, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I've been waiting for you, Mr. Gowan. We're going to take probably 1 or 2 more, and then we're going to make some assessment and invite speakers back. Yes.
So my name is James Calvin. I've been working with affiliates for the past half dozen years. But other than that, I've been a security technologist, professional for more than 30 years now. I knew the internet before it was the internet, and all of that. I'm going to take the privacy discussion that is often going on and take it in a slightly different direction by asking a question that I think we should consider, and that is or should anonymity or role-based identities be important in the digital world? What's interesting to me about all the discussions that we have about privacy and accountability and openness and transparency is it always feels like the foundation, the cornerstone of all of that is that I, as a physical being, have a single identity. And you are somehow going to bring everything back down to that point and know who I am. And one of the things that always occurred to me as public key infrastructures were originally being developed and thought about, certificates back in the day and identities. So I was curious about why can't I have different roles and different identities, and thus at some level I'm anonymous up to a point. I establish some kind of identifier to use in a certain context, so you can have continuity with respect to what I'm doing. But you cannot associate those things together. So big data, a lot of what you get with big data is the aggregation problem, right? I mean, that's what the internet gives to you. I can have a collection of data about me over here in this context, and a bunch of data about me over here in this context. And the fact is, it's possible now in our digital world to pull those things together and thus know more about me as a giant individual, if you will. But as individuals, we do serve in different roles. I mean, I wear many hats is sort of a common term that's used to describe the different things that you do. You're part of different organizations, boards, you're part of different bodies in ICANN or the ITF, ITU, and governance forums. And you represent different positions and different opportunities. Certainly your advice and what you know is shaped by the many other roles that you might have. But why should you be held accountable for those other roles in the role that you're serving now? And I think it's a question that we don't always ask ourselves. We don't make that distinction when we talk about privacy and identity. Should I be allowed to have different identities as long as I treat them in a consistent and bring continuity to those identities and they exist? Do they really all have to be brought together? And I think technology exists to support this if we want it. But we don't ask ourselves that question and we don't go down that path.
Thank you. Yes, Patrice, we have one, and then we're going to wrap up. So one more, and then we're going to go, and you're going to, okay, so we have Patrice and then you.
Good morning. I'm Patrice Lyons. I'm an attorney in Washington. And I've been involved in Internet matters for many, many years. I wasn't going to get up today until I listened to several of the speakers beforehand. And being an attorney, Georgetown graduate, I listened very carefully to some of the suggestions. Now I was thinking, these are suggestions for Internet governance, all right? We're going to have this world group, this group of people who self-select, pay their own way, and get there, trying to establish perhaps discussions of policy that could inadvertently establish some type of customary international law. That's a serious concern in my book, and it may have unintended consequences. So if these issues are discussed, and that's really fine, good to discuss them, caution should be taken not to view it as some type of supranational law. And I think that was maybe part of your suggestion, sir, that to sort of have super sovereignty. I think I got that right. I was at the IGF in Nairobi a couple of years ago, and they had this session on citizenship of the internet, whatever they define the internet as. And actually, I thought this panel was on new technology, and I was going to invite discussion when you get beyond the edge and the end, and how you manage things in all different ways, which we've been doing now for many years, end to end. That was yesterday. Let's look ahead. So we were at this session about citizenship and the internet, and there was this lovely young woman. It was a youth session. She came from the United Kingdom, and she stood up and she said, "I don't want to be a citizen of the world." She says, "I'm at the United Kingdom. I know the law and the responsibilities and my rights in that system." And she said she's looked around, and that kind of right and responsibility doesn't exist in many parts of the world. So would she inadvertently be subject to something that she doesn't think is appropriate? Now, anonymity, that's another issue the gentleman just mentioned. I was reading a case report, so we don't have all the details.
Trace?
Yeah.
Trace. But we're not,
minutes.
Yeah, no, but we're not critiquing the present approaches.
No,
I
I have a suggestion.
Fantastic.
My suggestion is right from the start, is that we shouldn't actually take steps that might be viewed as establishing something that might be viewed as customary international law. Because my main point was that you have the courts and the legal systems in various parts of the world that are starting to cope. I think some of the young clerks come in prepared, they have, computer savvy. And there was one case in Europe, and it had to do with a ferry that went ahead from one country to the other. And there was an ice bridge for most of the winter. And the ferry, because they wanted to take customers, broke the ice bridge. It's a local case, and the citizens were outraged, and they started, there was a news blog report. And of course that raises the question about what's journalism anyhow. So they had a news blog. So the citizens were outraged, and they were saying all sorts of vile things about this ferry company anonymously. The courts in the lower level said, well, they gave it a pass. But when it got up to the European Court, and I believe it was the Court of Human Rights, as I say, I just read it very briefly last evening, they actually said no, that news blog had the responsibility, and they should have anticipated that this was going to be a negative reaction and disparaging the reputation of this fine company, fine or not, they didn't make a value judgment, that they would have to have taken that down or prevented that anonymous speech in some ways. So you'll have these different cases in different parts of the world. So you can actually discuss them. You can maybe bring forward some ideas that you think are interesting. But I would strongly suggest that there shouldn't be a view to some sort of super sovereignty. Because I think that would, number one, wouldn't probably succeed because we have treaties and we have legal regimes. And number two, it's not really advisable.
Okay, and we have one more. Put you as far up at the... I did.
Hi, my name is A.J. Forziak. I'm here as an invitation from, I'm a student at the National Defense University. I'm currently a member of the Department of Defense and the intelligence community. So I'm totally out of my league being here, but I've got a really interesting, I have a question that I pose to, to this forum. In DoD and in the IC, for someone to operate on our networks, we go through a very arduous, it's called a certification and accreditation process. That allows us to, that protects us from threat vectors, it protects the data so folks can't access it. So I'm curious, is that kind of policy going to move into this sector? Where, if you open up a business, in the public sector, if you open a business, you have to follow codes and, switches have to be so high off the ground and things like that. So are you going to look at, for a business to operate on the internet, you have to protect your data to these standards? It's just something that, it works in most cases in the DoD. We have Snowden and those kind of things. Those are people that do that. But the system was in place. We have policies that are enforced that allow us to protect the data. That's what I care about as a person operating in the internet. So I'm just curious, is policy going to change so that we could have those steps in place for you to operate, hang your shingle, all right, Google, hang your shingle out there. You have to follow these steps so that we know the data is protected. So that's my question. Thanks.
Fantastic. Let me see if I can label that while Pavel's going back to the microphone or leaving us, I guess. So that's something related to trying to think of. No, well, that's about a user, but I thought AJ's comment was about the certification of the data stream. Thank you. Okay, so we need to spend a few minutes huddling among ourselves here, and then we're going to spend a couple of minutes huddling among ourselves, and then we're going to invite some of you back to the microphone to be questioned by your peers. I know you can't wait. Give us a minute.
There's numbers of things. That's interesting.
I got you.
I was sitting here and then I went and I was talking. That's okay, but the point is that
The question is whether the government should regulate the level of security. What about a brick and mortar store? Is there different levels of security to do they can offer their customers different levels of security. Like you can have this much security door at the front where they're going to bell the inside. But the government doesn't usually require private business to provide the most secure levels of data protection in this case available. Obviously, they voluntarily do VeriSign or do credit card protection, and they give that information. So it's be that the free market, and consumers are going to choose.
And the private sector doesn't want it, they don't do they have their voluntary standards which they all try to meet.
So the question is whether the regulation is
I mean, I would feel more, I would feel more secure knowing.
They are retarded.
The question is whether you need the government to tell you they already do follow certain secure protocols that they're run by. If you go to Amazon, the URL bar, it's going to show you
what they read. So it is a judgment statement, so that you force something you have to know because if you know it's the breach or it's it's a risk you're right.
that's already on the
Should you tell them to get in the car? You should have the responsibility to wait for you.
Some of the things just get like
consistent across the board.
When you come in to class tomorrow, that's just not big class.
No, but I've got legs.
Well, you know, what I was thinking about in terms of policy. I mean, we just don't speak as we were working, right? It's just policy, policy, and OPOD.
Weather's always bad.
You know, just waiting for you to speak. I don't know, I guess it's all
We're going to invite back 4 speakers, and we're going to offer the opportunity for the audience to ask them questions. So I'm going to take the roving mic and hand it around. We'll invite the speakers to come to the podium, and we're going to invite back Klaus, followed by Andrew. And Andrew, we would like you to focus on the first item. And then we are going to invite back Jim Galvin and Carl. So Klaus, would you like to kick off? And the audience is going to be able to ask questions, and I'm going to handle the microphone.
Okay, what's the questions?
So my first question to Klaus, and then I'm going to look to some of you to ask him questions as well. If you remember, Klaus's concept was that And I see this not as a new issue, but as an issue that isn't adequately addressed and has big implications for internet governance. It's the issue, I would say, of sort of informed, broad participation by a base, you called it base democracy. But it is really the issue of having more of the users actively understanding the technology and being engaged in internet governance and understanding different layers of how to participate. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me give you some very straightforward examples. Internet governance for me is, for example, a huge economical aspect. Look at the situation. I'm coming from the development world. Look at the situation with the GTLDs. How many applications did we have from Africa? 16 or 24.
Oh my God.
And I congratulate the Africans for not applying for more, but quite out of the simple reason because it showed they're not stupid. Because the point is very simple. If there is no, for example, there is no business model available, why should you invest $185,000 or whatsoever? But what I'm trying to come back to, because people didn't know, people didn't have the business models, people didn't have the base knowledge in the community. And because there is no base knowledge, there will be no economical opportunities of development. The other reasons, for example, for the business sector, or let's take my sector, is quite simply, how do you get that knowledge down there? Do you need huge campaigns and things like that? No. We just use the things we already have. For example, NGOs. NGOs are educators, multiplicators, evaluators, everything. You just simply need simple mechanisms to allow the people who are the end users, the people who are using the internet, to know how they are governed. And my experience in internet governance, and that's why I'm a proponent for that, is that there is a level in internet governance which is very much interested in not letting that information tripping down, because that ensures that they stay in charge and they get the travels and they get the funding and things like that. Internet governance is a very lucrative business. And we have to face it, and we have to deal with it. And I think there can be only legitimate internet governance if we make sure that people have the basic knowledge. The word ICANN needs to be known as other people need to know Coca-Cola. I'm sorry. And it's not elitist knowledge. It's just simply, this is my right. This is what I can do. This is my business opportunity. To come back to the GTLDs again. Everybody thinks about GTLDs, okay, let's make some money with GTLDs and selling domain names. Yeah, that's one way to make business. But for example, to build communities around GTLDs and send services around GTLDs and things like that is a different business model. People need to know about it.
So, Klaus, I'm just going to refocus one part of the question to ask you to respond to, and then see if there's one other person who wants to ask you a question. So if we could generalize this away from being aware and understanding ICANN to the broader issue of internet governance, which is a much broader issue. Could you also respond to how you might see helping to create end-user awareness about the broader internet governance issues?
Very simple. Try the multi-stakeholder model. Try win-win situations. For example, at the moment, it doesn't make sense for civil society to go out and trying to inform the rest of the world. It doesn't make sense for the governments to do that, and it doesn't make sense for the private sector to do it. It makes very much sense if all these sectors in a multi-stakeholder model work together and trying to create win-win-win situations. For example, why should business not use the outreach also for creating new markets and creating new ways? Why should civil society not use that, for example, for awareness building in other areas or for sustainability issues? It's a question of creating win-win situation in a multi-sector environment and not going out in one way or another.
Okay. So I think we're okay on this. Did you want to ask us a question, and then we'll move to our next speaker?
Well, the question I have in mind is, looking at internet governance stories that have gotten a lot of attention paid to them. It's basically when people think someone is going to try to break the internet, whether it's the specter of a UN takeover at Wicked or something like SOPA. I don't know that people, I can't quite blame people for not paying attention to other issues that don't involve a direct threat to the working of this. And I can tell you, getting people to read stories about internet governance when there's not something like Wicked is not the easiest thing in the world. Maybe I'm not writing good enough stories about them, I don't know.
There's a very, very
never
simple
stops.
story. Go to the next IGF, yeah, and task one person to go around to look at every single laptop directly into the screen they see walking around and reading the phone and so on. Then you have already that question of base. What is my right? Who stops somebody just to go around to watch at everybody's screen and to read it? That makes things relevant. That's the other whole secret in the whole thing. You need to make internet governance relevant to the end user. And you make it relevant in different areas. You make it relevant because it privacy issue. You make it relevant because it's a question of economic development. It's a question of bread on your table. For a lot of people nowadays, they make their money because they're using the internet in one way or another. It's bread on your family table. So why make that clear and make it relevant?
So I'm going to thank you. We're going to invite our next speaker, Carl. We have a question for you immediately.
Wait for the mic, sorry.
Sorry. Could you explain very briefly how the internet works and give us your name?
My name is Tina Aotis. For people to understand that it's infrastructure that's actually owned by someone and maintained by someone, to put into context the issue around the rights of people to use someone's infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, to explain the internet in 3 minutes, it's a pretty difficult task. I guess what I'd say before is I used a framework maybe to leverage the time I spent before. You basically have, I'll start with the hardware. You have people who build hardware, companies who build hardware that takes a lot of research and development, and that is then deployed in an environment, and then that is connected with electricity, and then software applications on top of that allow us to have all the services that we have. And the data we're talking about that we have some sense of ownership and privacy around, that flows across it. And it costs money to build this environment and this equipment, and to make sure these services are reliable and that we can count on them. And so there are companies that invest a lot to make that happen. And the point that the issue that I emphasized was, in order to make this happen, we have policies. And for the most part, the internet has thrived as it has because it's had a lot of flexibility and agility to do what makes sense to engineers. And engineers are actually creating a lot of policy without calling it policy, just by the way they go about creating things. And now, as there's increasing discussion about governance, the idea to force behaviors around what's done in the internet and in its future, I think a lot of engineers are sitting back and thinking, if this heads in the wrong direction, we always got other options we could play with. And I don't see that there's much awareness of that in the discussions. We could just always go around, we could tunnel through and do other things. So that's I think the main point, and hopefully that's answered your question.
No, it's the basic idea that all these discussions are going to sort of stop what people are doing on their own does get overlooked a lot. And this has been going on for years. If you remember in the 1990s, the whole debate of the Communications Decency Act, the whole idea that some people in Congress seriously thought you could just add an extra bit to every TCP/IP packet and that would stop obscenity online. No, it's a little too decentralized for that to work. So an awareness of how much you can feasibly accomplish, I wish more people would have that in mind. you might have fewer dumb ideas like SOPA, but assume you can just flip a switch and re-architect the internet all at once.
Yeah, Carl, thanks very much. Slightly different perspective on this. So, many of the fora that people like Marilyn and myself go to, where we negotiate at great length texts with representatives from other governments and other stakeholder groups, we do so not to try to curtail or inhibit technology in any way, but rather to come to agreement on texts that do the minimal damage more than anything else, unfortunately. And those texts are agreed amongst many different governments and stakeholders from around the globe. So I think in many ways, policy is playing catch-up. I mean, if you look at a lot of the technologies that are around today, we still don't know what policies Google Glass, for example, may result in, or how particular cutting-edge technologies may actually need or not need to be regulated or whatever in the future. So I think part of the issue is, I think you're absolutely right, technology will go on and on and on, and I think in many ways that what you're perceiving a little bit is the fact that some of us who are out there in the internet governance space are really kind of trying to draw lines in the sand to not lose the ability to actually go out and progress with technological developments and things like that. So there's just another dimension in that.
Yeah, I agree with the observation, the concept of catch-up. And the diagram I often show, I'll try to make with my arm here, is that the rate of technology advance is a very steep slope. It's very fast. And as far as we know, at its simplest level, it's maybe linear, but it's probably more exponential given what we're about to face with the Internet of Things. And the rate of policy is much slower. But I think it's a misperception to think that the catch-up is in the sense that it's actually closing the gap. You are catching up, and that you're falling behind, but the gap is actually increasing. And so that's an important dynamic, and that's the emphasis why I'm spending a lot of my time with organizations, like the IEEE, which has about 500,000 members, internationally represented. Most of the members are outside the U.S. And so this is where growth is going to take place, and this is where you're going to be able to help better define the solution space and bring that innovation that you're seeing in the technology also infused in the policy. There's nothing inherent in the policy infrastructure, that enables it to be as innovative as the technology to catch up. So you have to rely on the technologies to come down and help close that gap, I believe.
I'm going to make a quick comment, and then we're going to move to our two next speakers. I'm reminded of the experience of the narrowband internet, the comment about the Decency Communications Decency Act reminded me. In the early days of the narrowband internet, we spent an incredible amount of time talking to policymakers at a national level, at a local level, at a state level, introducing the internet to them so they would use it. There was no such thing as the World Wide Web. And I'm struck right now by the international fora that we sit in, Matthew, where the technology is so easy to use and it's so pervasive that it's being adopted by policymakers, but a fundamental understanding of how it works is missing. And I'm just going to make one comment. Recently, in a very serious, very difficult negotiation in WSIS plus 10, I thought we were going to get nowhere. And all of a sudden, one of the countries that is most concerned about restricting access to the internet became very enthused about youth entrepreneurs being able to use the internet to create jobs. And it changed the whole discussion when we were talking about how technology was going to be used to create jobs. We were talking about how technology was going to be used for freedom of speech. We couldn't even talk to each other. So I'm not saying that, but you've, this has been very...
Can I offer one example?
You can do it in 30 seconds because we've got two more speakers.
Okay, example of science diplomacy. I had an opportunity to engage in some bilateral context some Russians shortly after they had introduced a convention, an international convention for overseeing cyberspace. And basically it would require nation states to be responsible for the content that their population produce in cyberspace. And as opposed to addressing this issue from an ideological angle, I basically made the observation as a scientist to say, Eric Schmidt had suggested that all the information created from the beginning of time up until somewhere in the early 2002, 2003 is now generated every 2 days. So the question to my Russian colleagues, who were primarily, many of them were mathematicians, was what's an order of magnitude estimate for how many Russians it would take to oversee the Russian population's contributions to cyberspace? Could they get two to give an order of magnitude estimate and agreement? So the point was, it's not the 1950s anymore. It's impossible. You could not, it would be 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, whatever it would be economically impossible. And so here was a way where the scientific, mathematical disciplines could infuse a discussion to say, look, we're really orienting the discussion around the wrong axis. And we really need to move on and realize we really live in a new world at this point. So hopefully that's helpful. Thanks for inviting me back.
Thank you. And we're going to go, Jim, can I invite you back, please?
So, thank you for this invitation. I'm Marilyn Cave, and I'm here to help.
Excuse me, you're getting the pronunciation wrong. Yes, Mr. Galvin. So, do people have specific questions for him? Otherwise, the judges will ask a couple of questions. Let me refresh your memory that what Jim was talking about was what I would call role-based identity, and suggesting that you carry a functional responsibility when playing a particular role, and that it ought to be possible to sort of, I'm going to call it, wall off those responsibilities around that role in that space, and then play a different role with a different responsibility in a different space. Is that sort of what you said?
Yes. Okay.
So I have a question. Oh, Klaus wants to ask the question, yes.
It's a question of an experience. In a recent Internet Governance Forum, it turned out that there was a discussion string with included 6 different participants, which had a very lively conversations with each other, which went on over days, and it turned out it was one person. Is it legitimate or not?
Good question.
My answer to that is, I think that what I'm proposing is obviously a very different model from the way that we do things today, and so we would need to give consideration to how to deal with situations and circumstances just like that, right? I mean, you go back to the very early cartoon, which we all know the quote from, right, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, okay? There are circumstances under which having an identity, having a particular identity, and knowing what that is are important. So the question here is, should I be permitted to create identities as needed in order to conduct certain transactions? And then you take a step back and you ask, all right, in the situation that you're really referring to, if I have a forum, is it important that I have unique identities, but based on what? What is the basis for that uniqueness? Was it irrelevant for one person to have 5 different personas and use that to educate and create an opportunity for people to see all sides of the question? One could argue that might be considered success if you've educated a set of people about something. But that just depends on the forum and the context in which it was there.
We're going to give Patrice the microphone, and then I have a question for you. Remember, your questions are about fleshing out the position that the speaker is making, because we're going to make a decision about what goes forward in our recommendation.
Okay, I've been involved in federated identity management for quite some time now. We have a standard that was just developed, X1255, out of ITUT. And basically, there were a lot of different trust frameworks in the United States and some in Europe. And you had OIX and Microsoft. And Kantara, ISOC has Kantara, I believe they took that under its wing. So what you're having now is the ability to have identifiers as a technical policy. You have identifiers as a social trust policy. You have trust frameworks that allow you to have specific identities for specific purposes. Then you have the social frameworks, and then you get into the privacy and the droit de l'oubli, the right to be forgotten. And so you can have different policies, and that's one thing about this discussion, Marilyn, I'm looking at here. There's no granularity as to the nature of the policy. It's kind of very open-ended. Because you could look at this earlier, and my comment was that the European Court has recently addressed anonymity and the responsibility of folks that news blog that allow people to criticize somebody else and defame their character, their reputation. Tort, you have a torts, and you get into usual law. So I guess my question, and it's just an observation more than just a question, is that could we be a little more specific, whether we're talking about the technical policy, which sometimes is called a standard, like the recent federated identity management exercise I've been involved in, or the identification of data structures in big data. That's another exercise going on. So different cuts you could take about it.
So I agree with you, and let me respond in the following way when you talk about the question of granularity. I mean, speaking as a technologist, what occurs to me in all of this space is we almost always think about privacy. It's very closely related with confidentiality, and we talk about that kind of security service. But what's interesting about the way we implement it, almost always on the internet, and if you look at all of our protocols, is the assumption is there's identity underneath it, there's authentication underneath it. And the granularity is, whatever the mechanism is that's underneath that, that's the way that we do it. And I more than anything, am simply asking the question about, is it possible to have privacy? Is it possible in our digital world? We should take a step back and ask ourselves, can I provide privacy? Can I provide transparency, if you will, and not actually tie it to a physical identity? Can I have a role-based identity that I use for that purpose, and thus I have some level of anonymity?
But that's what I was trying to address, because you have the representation, the attributes of the you that are represented and converted, or there's a form that's essentially bits. Computers know about bits, so you have to look at the technical system that's implementing it. And basically the internet now is growing up, it's moving beyond end to end, and you actually are introducing the ability to take information and represent it as or convert it to these machine-independent data structures. So then you can have multiple identifiers for that. Now, whether you want to identify yourself as anonymous, or you want to put your name on it, your dog's name, or whatever, it depends upon the technology in question. So the internet is just not like a road running under stuff anymore. It never was, actually.
So the question, okay. Rob, you have a question for him?
Yeah, I wanted to sort of make sure I'm understanding you correctly. So yesterday, Google finally accepted the obvious and said, you can use made-up names in Google+. Pick your pseudonym and you can have that be your identity. Is that more along the lines of what you'd like to see?
Yeah, as Patrice is up here talking, that's a social policy. I think, let me cast into something concrete what really motivates my asking this question in a larger context, okay? As the internet, as we know it today, was first coming into existence, you go back to the mid-90s and you come forward, I was always struck by, is it possible to conduct monetary transactions and do it anonymously? Can I be anonymous on the internet, right? I mean, in the real world, the physical world, you can be, because you can always pay cash. Well, you don't really have cash on the internet.
So with Bitcoin and the blockchain, have we solved that?
Well, I'm not actually necessarily for creating digital cash, okay? So there have been some technologies that have tried to do that and have that kind of mechanism around. I observe, you cast it into credit cards and you look at that kind of system. Doesn't necessarily apply everywhere.
Because I really need to push us to wrap up, because we do have a speaker at lunch.
Okay, so I'm sorry. So just quickly, the idea is my credit card is in effect an identity, and why shouldn't that number be sufficient to identify me and guarantee that I can do things? Now, I'm only pseudonymous on the internet because the credit card company will know who I am. Okay, but now when you try to conduct transactions online with your credit card, you often have to give your billing address, at least from the US, when you use those kinds of things and that kind of stuff. And so you're sort of tying things together, and I'm asking the question, do we really need to do that? We're not actually asking ourselves if anonymity or any kind of role-based identity is something the internet should carry forward. We had it in the physical world. Should we be continuing to support that in the digital world?
Okay, and we're going to move to Andrew for just the first question, and we're going to do this quickly. Thank you. And then the judges are going to give you our decision. So you want to just recap, or do you want me to do that for you?
Well, I mean, my concern is freedom of speech has occupied a great deal of attention, but it's in some respects subordinate in importance to the freedom of assembly, freedom of virtual assembly, freedom of association, which makes speech meaningful.
So do we have questions? Anyone in the audience have a question? Let me kick off. I like the way you tied that together, but I wanted to kind of, so I guess I was actually in Syria right before you, where I was there in March. And I think this whole concept that the internet as a communications tool is allowing people to replace the physical, not just access to information and knowledge, but also the ability to actually congregate and to assemble, is an interesting concept, and one that perhaps we haven't really thought enough about. Certainly a lot of the new social media tools, I guess, are sort of based on that, but you're sort of looking at it as the idea that we ought to perhaps go further when we say freedom of speech, and also talk about additional human rights or rights associated with that.
I think that's right, and there are pluses and minuses here, and when I realized I was going to be calling to come back down here, I started thinking more deeply about it. It's not just facilitating association and assembly, it's facilitating something that is harder, much harder offline, and that is learning whom you want to associate with. So there is a whole discovery aspect of enabling assembly and association that the internet facilitates. And the internet does become the soapbox for everyone and the audience room for everyone. But an association is the name of a group. And when we think about surveillance, what does the government want to surveil more than associations? They want to know who you're talking to. They want to know who's coming together. So let's look at some other names for different types of groups other than associations. There are corporations, mobs, gangs, and conspiracies. Because all of those are something that is empowered by the connectedness. And we have a whole statute, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations statute, which is all about the operation of groups called enterprises through illegal means. And the difficulty is this is something that we conceive of as a fundamental right, yet it is conceived by powers as a fundamental threat. And then there's an interesting question of interlay between the right to associate, the right to assembly, and the right to privacy. And there's an interesting question. Is there a right to private association? I wish I had the answers. Stay tuned.
So do we have another question from the audience? Yes.
I just wanted to tie a thread together. Everybody can hear me. I've got
Regardless of webcasting.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to tie, I really like blockchain. I think it's just an absolutely brilliant, and tying that together with the freedom to associate in an anonymous way. So, and I'm also sort of in the back of my mind, as I said before about looking at the architecture stuff with a 3D, you're going to be able to create your own individualized chips. We've lived in this world in which we have a handful of global companies that work on the standards of the chips and the algorithms that sit on the chips. What happens when, starting with the, the early adapters, but you progressively work yourself into a situation as you do now, where kids are learning in kindergarten, grade school, how to, write code, right? So you'll create your own chip, and you'll just download an algorithm that you kind of like to go with that to do what you want to do. Talk about disruption. We're talking about the Carter phone, and all of a sudden, boom, hey, you don't have to have this little dial thing on your desk. But what I'm saying is, that's a unique thing if you look at how blockchain is put together, and how that association works with individuals, trusted but anonymous, and how what you're talking about. It's an interesting. Anyway, I just throw that out there to think.
1 minute, the judges want to make a ruling.
I'll just say, it's interesting to see there's whisper and secret. We have WhatsApp. We have a proliferation of a whole new set of protocols, technologies, methods for people to be communicating in all sorts of different ways. And who knows where that will end. And if you dam up one, the water will find its way to another course. Thank you.
That was perfect, and now the 3 judges have a ruling. We're going, first of all, we want to thank all of you for participating, and I'm going to propose the following. We're going to merge James Galvin's point, and Andrew's, because there's a lot of consistency and overlap, and we will work with the 2 of you, on how we articulate that. Carl, we are very excited about the idea of creating an awareness and an understanding of the importance of inclusion of the engineers and the scientists in the internet governance debates. So we're going to think more about that, and that'll be our second point that we're going to bring forward. And then, Klaus, I'm going to work a little bit more with Matthew and Rob on fine-tuning how we describe the importance of an informed citizenry of users, and how it is important that they are abreast and aware of what is going on in internet governance, how it affects their daily life, and how they are communicating with policymakers. So those are the 3 topics that we plan to report out on, and we will be then taking those forward into the Internet Governance Forum as ideas that may not be, they are kind of emerging issues. As you can see, what we've done is we've taken a little bit from changes in technology that are sort of pointing to the fact that some things aren't being addressed well enough, and in a couple of other cases, I think, and that's where I think Andrew and James' point comes in. For Carl, I think it's almost, I would say, it's an area of, we have forgotten how important it is to involve the engineers and the scientists and the role that they can play in internet governance and in diplomacy. And so I have bad news for you in particular. I expect we have a lot more work for you.
We're here.
Thanks everyone for participating and for making this an interesting session. Lunch, and there is a very interesting speaker, and we will see you during the rest of the day.
Yeah. It definitely smoothed out. After the first few minutes, it was okay. It was hard to set.